Well, happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to WAVY.com and to the WAVY Facebook page. I'm Jason Marks, and once again, we're talking about the Patients vs. Perwaiz. This is our year-long docu-series that we've been working on into Dr. Javed Perwaiz, the Chesapeake OB-GYN, who was found guilty in November of health insurance fraud for doing unnecessary surgeries. Now, we're all the way up to Chapter 9, and in Chapter 9, we really start to hold people accountable and try to figure out if there were balls that were dropped and could Dr. Javed Perwaiz have been stopped even sooner. Before we bring in Adrian and Kevin, let me show you a sneak peek of what you'll find right now on WAVY.com.
This is the grounds of defense where Dr. Perwaiz was suing me because I owed him money from all the surgeries. Most people, especially women, hold their physicians in the highest esteem and literally put their life in the doctor's hands. This was the case with me. After all, he told me he was my friend and he was looking out for my best interest. If only I knew. I feel betrayed by Dr. Perwaiz and the confidence and trust that I put in him.
This is a failure of action, and definitely many patients had to pay the price.
The one agency that has the power to do something about his, or in the case of women, her practices, is the State Medical Board, and the State Medical Board didn't do anything at all.
I just thank God that I finally came to my senses and don't see him anymore. I wish there was a way to revoke his license. He is dangerous.
Do you want to know ultimately who dropped the ball?
Of course, I'm a woman. We're nosy. You gonna tell me?
And that was Susan Anderson there, who lives in Gates County. We try to tell you, right? Adrian's on the top. Adrian Mayfield, executive producer. Kevin Rahm, photojournalist, is on the bottom. And Adrian, obviously, Chapter 9, we're starting near the end. We have one more chapter left. And this is the chapter where we really start to put all the pieces together that you've seen throughout the first 8 chapters.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the culmination of that year-long reporting, and I have a mix of emotions listening to Susan Anderson read her letter because she's such a nice lady. She welcomed us into her home. She rehashed a lot of things that happened in the 90s to her when she was a patient of Dr. Perwaiz, and they were very hurtful. They lingered with her, but she's also got a wonderful spirit. So Susan Anderson was one of the earliest red flags that we identified in our reporting, and I think Chapter 9 is the culmination of all of those red flags. We take you through step by step every single kind of warning sign that we identified during our reporting or during the court trial. Susan Anderson is one of the earliest, as I said. She essentially accused Dr. Perwaiz of the scheme that he was going to be convicted of, almost 30 years later, but she did it within, 10 years of him practicing medicine. So that, to me, I have to say it wasn't shocking after learning what we learned during our reporting,
Yep.
But I think, the reason she decided to talk was because I told her, listen, Susan, this is impactful. This is
Sure.
a major letter, a major warning sign that we'd like to report to the public so that they know that people were reporting Dr. Perwaiz far before the FBI got involved.
And you bring up an interesting point because we found Susan Anderson and we found her name while we were digging through court records in Chesapeake. And it just so happens that Dr. Perwaiz actually took Susan Anderson to court. And because she had an outstanding bill of $1,140 and she decided she wasn't going to pay it anymore because she had all these surgeries and she thought, man, something was wrong. All these surgeries, I'm not paying him anymore. And he ended up taking her to court and he won. And that's how we got Susan Anderson. And Adrian, obviously you mentioned it, Susan Anderson did not want to talk to us at first.
Yeah, she was very torn. I remember the day that I called her and I said, hi, Susan, my name's Adrian. I work at WAVY TV. I know it's a little weird to hear from me out of the blue, but I'm calling about Dr. Javed Perwaiz. And she was very kind, but obviously very hesitant. It was a couple of months of us talking a little bit here and there before she decided to do it. And the reason why ultimately she decided to interview with us was because her daughter was also a patient, despite her mom kind of giving her a warning, telling her about what she'd been through. The thing with Susan Anderson is she wrote a letter to the judge. She wrote a letter to the Virginia Board of Medicine. She was sued for paying the bill, but all of the allegations she made in that letter, she says were backed up by a second doctor. She had several surgeries that left the lining of her uterus paper thin. She had a hysterectomy that another doctor said was not necessary. And that letter to the judge wasn't just I don't want to pay this. It was a cry for help. Please, somebody step in. Yep. He's dangerous. She says he's dangerous.
And you mentioned her daughter. She warned her daughter, but her daughter also had another surgery by him. And she was like, I told her, I knew that shouldn't have happened. We also get into the State Board of Medicine. And Kevin, this is probably one of the big cruxes of this chapter, is because the fact is the Board of Medicine licensed all the doctors and all of medical health, everyone who practices medicine here in the state. And obviously the Board of Medicine did not get involved probably early enough in this case.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. And I just want to touch on the Susan Anderson story real quick. I mean, we're talking about $1,200 that she's being sued by Dr. Perwaiz. I know we touched on previous chapters where he's made hundreds of thousands of dollars, and to think of him winning over $1,200 in court with Susan Anderson after all the things that he did to her, it really is, I mean, it really puts me at a loss for words that it just seems so small in the grand scheme of things for him to be, I mean, taking her to court and whatnot over $1,200 and him winning. It just seems, it's just really sad as to how sad this story is. But yeah, touching on the Board of Medicine, you know, we went up there and we went to Richmond after we felt like we weren't getting the answers that we wanted to, and we wanted to confront them and to hear what they had to say directly. And I mean, you can see it in Chapter 9, their response to us just mentioning Dr. Perwaiz and how we're doing a story on them. And the first thing that one of the doctors did was just start to walk away and say, you know, I know nothing about that, and kind of just lead us away as quickly as they could. And it was definitely a telling experience for me going up there and doing that.
Yeah, we're now starting to get some Facebook comments. If you have a question about the docu-series or about the chapter or about Dr. Perwaiz, certainly go ahead and leave a comment or a question, and we'll certainly try to get to it here in the next 20 minutes while we're with you. Adrian, obviously, we talked about the Board of Medicine, and we spoke with Delegate Steve Heretic, who was part of the Board of Medicine for a very long time. He actually was the first and likely right now the only non-doctor who has ever been the president of the Board of Medicine. And he was very frank about what the board did in the early 80s when it came to Maryview and having his license revoked, not his license, but his credentials revoked from Maryview. And then he was obviously given like a censure, which was just a slap on the wrist by the Board of Medicine.
Yeah, I was really happy to hear from Delegate Heretic that he was, quite frankly, blown away and disgusted by the board's decision in 1984 when they essentially gave Dr. Perwaiz a slap on the wrist for the very serious allegations of performing unnecessary hysterectomies on more than a dozen women and having a sexual relationship with one of his patients. Delegate Heretic, who served on the Board of Medicine in the late 2010 to 2014 area, he said that the Board of Medicine now is very different than it was nearly 40 years ago, and that kind of conduct would have resulted in a revocation of the doctor's license immediately. It's kind of like, if I can draw a parallel, you know, you're a kid, you're driving your car, you get into a fender bender. Does your mom and dad take away your license and force you to become a better driver before letting you out on the road? Or do they just say, hey, you know, spend a night at home, sit around, you're grounded for a night? And that's kind of what happened with Dr. Perwaiz. Nobody took away his license and forced him to look at that process and to become a better doctor. And Delegate Heretic essentially said the board wouldn't operate that way now. Unfortunately, I'm not saying that I doubt what he has to say, but we didn't get to hear from any current board members. And as an investigative journalist, as a journalist, I think the whole team believes in transparency. So we were pretty disappointed that current board members wouldn't even sit down to talk with us about the process.
Yeah, we certainly tried. I mean, Christina just wrote in, knowing that the powers who are responsible for medical oversight have failed Perwaiz's victims by ignoring their concerns. How can we protect ourselves from potential abuse from other medical practitioners in our lives? And obviously, it's a great question, and that's really the reason why we're doing this. One of our goals and part of this was to try to figure out who dropped the ball, and then try to figure out if it's a broken system, or is this just a strange situation that involved a bad doctor. I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to get down to, and that's why literally we were trying to talk to the Board of Medicine. What we had to cut out from this chapter, which I think is important, we should probably go through it right now, is how the Board of Medicine works. So the Board of Medicine is made up of 18 doctors. You'll see that in the chapter. And the doctors, they do all sorts of things. I mean, you have you know, neurosurgeons and OBGYNs and you know, doctors, cardiologists from all over the state who make up this board. And they're really like a city council, essentially. And what they do is, we have in the board the Board of Medicine gets about 2,000 complaints a year. And those complaints range between really, really serious complaints and then complaints simply where you sat in your doctor's office too long and you want to complain about it. And they try to divide those up, and then they go through those. And they try to figure out, obviously, what's the most important. And they have investigators who then go and they vet all of these complaints, the 2,000 complaints, and then the most serious ones that they believe need to take some action against a doctor are then sent to the board, who then looks at, they get the file, and then they decide, guys, together at that point, if some sort of disciplinary action should be taken. And then what happens is the board convenes, and then it's an open process. Anyone can go, and it's usually once a quarter, and they have essentially a trial right there on the spot where the doctor comes in and he has an attorney, and they go back and forth, and then they decide what sort of disciplinary action should be taken against that doctor. And Kevin, you mentioned it. We went to the board because we weren't getting any answers, and we sat there in that public meeting, and literally I mean, it was like roaches when the lights come on, right? And they just scurried right after that meeting because they knew we were trying to get some answers.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in Chapter 9. We go up and you try to get the attention of one of the doctors, and you go up to him. I mean, we were being very cordial. We just, you know, asked, hey, we just have a couple of questions. And before you could even really get your first question out, you barely even got your name out and who we worked for, before he was being ushered away and saying, oh, I'm sorry, that we have something else that we need to attend to right now. I'll get back to you. And then, of course, we never heard back from that doctor
himself. He
himself.
never came back, did he?
Heard from, no. I mean, I guess I wasn't surprised that he didn't come back, but nevertheless, he didn't. And I mean, that happened twice in the same sitting. And so it was unfortunate because we're not trying to come after them and to make anyone look bad. We just wanted some answers and some simple answers. And unfortunately, we couldn't get that there at that time.
Yeah, and let me be fair to the Board of Medicine real fast, because they have been very responsive. And every time we email them, they do email a response. And so we want to be fair to the Board of Medicine. But the response has always been no, 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 or sending us a link to policies or procedures. And when we want to sit down and talk about these policies and procedures, whether it was Perwaiz driven or not, they've always said no. So if we wanted to sit down with a member of the Board of Medicine or anybody from the Department of Health Professions, just simply to talk about, hey, what happens when a complaint comes in? Can you just talk it through with us? Even that, we got to know, Adrian. I mean, it was just repeatedly, over and over again. Anything we asked, it was always no. Very responsive, but never the response that would allow us to ask any more questions.
Yeah, there was definitely a limitation on the types of questions we could ask because there were certain questions they weren't going to answer, and there are regulations and rules they have to follow.
Absolutely.
But none of those include having a board member sit down and talk with us about process. But to kind of hop back to the question that Christina asked, we sat down with 2 experts from Public Citizen who have spent several years studying specifically healthcare systems. They do reporting on healthcare systems, including doctor and physician accountability. And those experts told us that the healthcare system, multi-layered, and each one of those layers is supposed to provide as kind of a safeguard for patients, but because of different limitations, it does result in these loopholes that allow a doctor like Dr. Javed Perwaiz to exist and to, quite honestly, flourish in the healthcare system. One of those issues is that the Board of Medicine is doctors self-regulating doctors. Having somebody like Delegate Heretic on the Board of Medicine isn't usual, it's not mandatory. So you're expecting doctors to regulate one another. Another issue is that hospitals, who are supposed to be reporting disciplinary actions of 30 days or more for these doctors, can find the loophole of only disciplining a doctor for a serious offense for 29 days, and then they don't have to report that to the National Doctor or National Practitioner Data Bank, which is a kind of, I don't want to call it secret because it is public for hospitals and insurance companies, but it's not public for citizens like us, and it's a repository of malpractice lawsuits, of disciplinary actions, and of board actions. So it's kind of this one resource that hospitals and insurance companies can use to find out if a doctor's essentially made mistakes or been a bad doctor. So that's not public to citizens. Doctors are disciplining doctors. Hospitals have financial incentives not to discipline doctors. And then malpractice. Jason, you can talk about this, but malpractice, so hard to prove. So it's hard for patients to advocate for themselves.
And we've got some questions about, as you know, as this chat has been going along, we have several people asking about lawsuits, and we really promise we're going to get in those next chapter. We talk about lawsuits, we talk to a malpractice attorney, and it really is a difficult process. And I don't want to give too much away from chapter 10, but I can tell you that there's a statute of limitations. There is a really high burden to prove. You have to have an expert come in who can verify to the court that this is malpractice. And so malpractice is very, very difficult. And that's what a lot of these attorneys right now are trying to figure out when it comes to Perwaiz patients. And they also have to have medical records. Remember that. You have to have the medical records to show that there was malpractice. And we'll say a patient from the 90s, they don't have their records. And so that's an issue. So there's a lot of things going on when it comes to malpractice. So guys, I want to ask you, we asked Susan Anderson, and you saw her at the very beginning of that clip. She says she wants to know who dropped the ball. What do you think? Do we have an answer?
I think that we have several answers. I think the overarching answer is yes, somebody did. And I think our reporting shows it wasn't just one. It wasn't just the Board of Medicine. It wasn't just the hospital. It wasn't just, you know, the government who dropped the ball. I think these situations came together and there was a lack of follow through on the behalf of insurance companies, on the behalf of hospital staff, on the behalf of the Board of Medicine. Every one of these agencies had an opportunity to push pause, to ask more questions, to investigate, and they didn't.
Yeah. And it's not saying that they did anything necessarily wrong. It's just that they could have gone further. Right. I mean, the steps could have been taken, or you could have just gone that extra, Kevin, that extra little bit that would have maybe stopped it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it is hard to find the sole source of accountability for, I mean, dropping the ball in this case. And we brought up to Delegate Heretic about how when we talked to Beth Usey, the federal prosecutor, why it was, I guess, an elongated process to get the scalpel out of Dr. Perwaiz's hands when he was being investigated. And I guess the interaction between the Board of Medicine and federal prosecutors about disclosing why the federal government was investigating him and how the information and the evidence wasn't necessarily given to the Board of Medicine so that they could come to the conclusion after looking at the evidence and say, okay, yes, we do need to suspend his license as quickly as possible. instead of waiting, what they told the federal government was, you know, since you're not giving us any information, we can't suspend his license for any period of time. We can't speed up that process. So, I mean, it's really just the different branches coming together and, like Adrian said, you know, just the push-pause, just going that step further and asking that extra question, well, can you please just send me a little bit of information? And I think that would have at least stopped it a little bit sooner, and even just stopping it a little bit sooner could have helped countless numbers of patients.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what Kevin just mentioned, the Board of Medicine says it needs to have some sort of evidence before it could go ahead and even just emergency suspend a license. They need to see something. There's got to be a reason, because if not, then Perwaiz could have gone to court, had an immediate hearing, and then the judge would have said, well, what's the evidence? Why did you suspend his license? And then there'd be no evidence, and then obviously he would get his license right back. So what Heretic is saying is that a lot of times, especially in the western part of the state, where it's a different district, the sharing between the Board of Medicine and the federal government out that way, the Department of Justice in the western part of the state, it's a lot better than in the eastern part of the state. And we asked federal prosecutors here in the eastern part, why wasn't any information shared with the Board of Medicine? And we never heard a response. I'm sure, I don't want to speak for them guys, but I can imagine they have an investigation going on, and no one likes to tip. If you're in law enforcement, you don't want to tip your hand to what you're investigating, but it's a double-edged sword, because you got to tip a little bit for that license to be revoked according to the Board of Medicine.
Yeah, so I think that it's a kind of a convoluted issue, especially when you look at somebody like Dr. Perwaiz, but I'm just going to speak to facts of this case. In our investigation, we interviewed people outside of the time frame of Dr. Perwaiz's conviction. But what the facts are of this case that we know, because he is convicted, is that for at least 10 years, Dr. Perwaiz was performing unnecessary surgeries and procedures on women to make money off of insurance, and hospital workers knew and reported it. There was at least one letter written to the Board of Medicine during that time. We also know that there was an insurance audit that found him to be an extreme outlier. We know that the FBI was tipped off by another nurse. We know that there were red flags throughout that 10 years, and that conviction stands for those 10 years. Some of the cases that you heard in court, Jason, were egregious, and so it is very difficult to accept that through all of these red flags we see, all of these people who knew something, that it continued to go this long, because they were egregious. Yep. Why didn't somebody take it a step further, I think, is my question. I know that somebody dropped the ball. I know what they didn't do. I want to know why, you know?
Right, and that's unfortunately probably what we'll never learn. You know, I don't think that's probably the million-dollar question, all this, and something that we'll probably never find the answer to, because obviously a lot of money's at stake. And if someone steps up, if it was a hospital, if it's an insurance company, if it's the Board of Medicine, it's a lot of money out there, and you know, no one wants to admit guilt, because then there's a civil suit behind that. So, no, we're not saying anyone's guilty. We just believe that there were companies and organizations and that maybe could have gone a step further.
Well, we know from the trial that there were examples of of hospitals, insurance companies having the knowledge and not stopping Dr. Perwaiz. We don't know who knew what or who's guilty of what. What we know is that there was knowledge that was not acted on.
And what we know is that there are patients who are still dealing with trauma today.
Absolutely.
Years and years, and there are patients out there, Kevin, who don't realize yet that they're going to have trauma, and therapists are working with those patients, and that's going to be the focus of Chapter 10, what's left for these patients, and you're working on that now. And obviously, the one thing that struck me talking to these therapists is that there are times when trauma doesn't show up till years down the road. So there could be a woman right now who's in her 30s, and the trauma doesn't show up until the 50s.
Yeah, and you know, that's one of the most scary aspects of a case like this, is the PTSD and the downfall years later that could come. And I mean, it could come at any moment. You just have no idea, and you don't know what could trigger it, but you know the source of where it came from, and all that pain, and a lot of these women, the pain that they felt. And yeah, like you said, Jason, in Chapter 10, we're going to talk to a couple different therapists, and we're going to have a couple of patients that we featured in earlier chapters tell us about their impact statements that they would have read in front of Dr. Perwaiz, and it's kind of just like what they would say to him face to face, and it's incredibly powerful what they have to say and the emotion that's behind it, and you could just sense the pain that he caused them, and they definitely don't fall short of telling him what they think that he deserves in terms of his sentencing.
Yeah, and that's in Chapter 10, which is released Thursday morning. It's the last chapter in this until his sentencing. And just for those of you who don't know, he is facing 465 years in prison. He was found guilty by a jury in November. His sentencing was scheduled for March. Due to COVID, it has been pushed back to May, and of course, we'll be there for the sentencing. We'll have Chapter 10 on WAVY.com when it comes out. The other chapters are on WAVY.com right now, and there are all sorts of resources on there if you are a patient. We mentioned this therapy group that has been set up strictly for Perwaiz patients. It's called the Women's Resource Collaborative. It's made up of local therapists. The FBI reached out to them, and we get into that in Chapter 10, but the information's already right now on WAVY.com on the Patients vs. Perwaiz webpage. Anything else, guys, before we call it a weekend here?
I just want to say thanks to all the viewers who have stuck with us through this project.
Yeah, absolutely.
And especially thank you to the patients who have made this project possible. And if you are a patient, regardless if you've talked to us or the FBI and you feel like you need resources, just like Jason said, on WAVY.com you can find information about that collaborative. It's going to be free or cost effective because they want to help as many patients as possible. And I don't want to give too much away about the therapists and what they say, but as you guys have both reiterated already, trauma is expressed in different forms through different people, and they're there for anyone, no matter how big or insignificant you feel like your experience is. They want to hear from you.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, you know, obviously,
Absolutely.
if you are a patient, reach out to me, jason.marks@wavy.com, or you know, find me on Facebook or something like that, and I'll make sure you know where to go to get the resources that are there for you, that are available right now. But yeah, Chapter 10 is all about the patients, what the patients, the therapy, the civil lawsuits, the malpractice, everything that deals with the patients, and you'll hear from them some of their victim impact statements, as Kevin talked about. So we're going to wrap things up here. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to talk the Patients vs. Perwaiz with us today. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next Friday for Chapter 10, the last chapter at 1:15. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you now.